One of the biggest mistakes people make after losing an avoidant is believing that more effort will somehow create more love. They think if they send one more message, explain themselves one more time, or prove their loyalty hard enough, the avoidant will finally understand what they're losing. But psychologically, that approach usually creates the exact opposite effect. The more you chase an avoidant, the more pressure they feel. And the more pressure they feel, the more distance they create. You have to understand how avoidance operates beneath the surface. Most avoidants are not running because they feel nothing. They are running because emotional intensity activates discomfort, fear, and internal conflict they never learned how to process. When someone constantly pursues them, emotionally pulls at them, or demands reassurance, their nervous system interprets it as loss of control. So even if part of them cares deeply, another part instinctively wants escape. This is why silence becomes powerful. Not fake silence designed to manipulate them. Real silence. Real emotional discipline. The kind of silence that comes from self-respect instead of emotional exhaustion, because when you stop chasing, something changes psychologically. For the first time, the avoidant is left alone with their own thoughts. There is no emotional noise to distract them anymore. No constant reassurance that you will always be there regardless of how they behave. And suddenly, the emotional certainty they depended on disappears. Human beings rarely value what feels permanently available. Familiarity creates emotional blindness. When someone believes they can return whenever they want, they stop feeling the urgency of loss. But the moment your energy changes, the moment you become calm, centered, and emotionally unavailable to dysfunction, their mind starts noticing the absence. And absence is psychologically louder than presence. Most people don't realize this, but silence creates reflection. Chasing creates resistance. The avoidant expects pursuit because pursuit keeps the emotional dynamic predictable. They withdraw, you chase. They become distant, you panic. They disappear, you reach harder. The pattern repeats itself so many times that it becomes emotionally familiar to them. But when you suddenly stop participating in that cycle, the predictability disappears. And unpredictability creates a tension. Now they start wondering why you became quiet. Now they start checking whether you moved on. Now they begin questioning whether they misunderstood your value. This is where emotional power shifts. Not because you're playing games, but because you're no longer abandoning yourself in order to hold on to someone else. There's a massive philosophical difference between love and attachment. Attachment says, I need you to choose me so I can feel okay. Love says, I value you deeply, but I will not destroy myself trying to force connection. That distinction changes everything. People often think strength means fighting harder for someone. Sometimes strength means becoming still. Sometimes strength means resisting the urge to interrupt silence just because loneliness feels uncomfortable. Because growth happens in silence. Clarity happens in silence. And for the avoidant, consequences also happen in silence. The moment they no longer feel your constant emotional availability, reality begins replacing fantasy. They can no longer assume your loyalty is permanent. They can no longer emotionally control the distance while still keeping access to your energy. And that is when many avoidants begin feeling something they spent months suppressing: loss. But here's the deeper truth most people miss. Your silence is not valuable because it brings them back. Your silence is valuable because it brings you back to yourself. Because when you stop chasing validation from someone emotionally unavailable, you finally create space to rebuild your confidence, your identity, and your peace. And ironically, that grounded energy is often what makes the avoidant look back in the first place. The moment you stop running after them is often the moment they finally feel the weight of losing you. After someone emotionally withdraws from your life, the natural instinct is to focus entirely on them. You start analyzing their behavior, replaying conversations, searching for hidden meanings in silence, trying to understand what changed, and without realizing it, your entire emotional world begins orbiting around one question: how do I get them back? But that question is dangerous because it immediately places your emotional power in someone else's hands. The strongest shift you can make after losing an avoidant is this: stop making your life about being chosen by them and start making your life valuable to yourself again. Because the truth is, avoidants are often deeply attracted to people who are emotionally independent, purposeful, and internally fulfilled. What initially draws them in is usually strength, confidence, mystery, ambition, calmness, not desperation, obsession, or emotional dependency. But when heartbreak happens, many people abandon the very qualities that made them attractive in the first place. They stop building their own life and start emotionally waiting. And waiting drains your identity. Psychologically, this happens because rejection activates survival mechanisms in the brain. Human beings are wired to seek reconnection after emotional separation. So the mind becomes fixated on restoring attachment at all costs. But the irony is that the harder you chase external validation, the weaker your internal state becomes. Your confidence starts depending on another person's attention. Your mood depends on whether they text you. Your sense of worth depends on whether they return. That is not love. That is emotional outsourcing. Real transformation begins the moment you redirect that energy inward. Instead of asking, how do I make them value me? Ask, how do I rebuild a life so strong that I value myself again? That question changes the entire trajectory of your healing. Because self-respect is magnetic, not in a superficial social media sense, not fake confidence designed to trigger jealousy. Real self-respect, the kind built quietly through discipline, emotional control, purpose, growth, and standards. When you begin improving your body, your mind, your habits, your finances, your emotional intelligence, your spiritual life, something profound happens psychologically. You stop radiating fear of loss, and people can feel that energy immediately. Avoidants especially notice this shift because they are highly sensitive to emotional pressure. When someone needs them constantly, they feel trapped. But when someone is emotionally grounded and genuinely fulfilled without demanding reassurance, it creates attraction instead of resistance. This is why growth becomes so powerful. Not because growth is a strategy to manipulate someone into returning, but because growth changes your entire emotional presence. You walk differently. You speak differently. You react differently. There's less panic in your energy, less emotional chaos, less need to control outcomes. And ironically, that calmness often creates curiosity in the avoidant mind. They begin wondering how you became so strong without them. They begin noticing that you no longer revolve around their approval. And that realization forces them to confront something uncomfortable. Maybe they underestimated your value. Most people believe attraction is created through pursuit, but mature attraction is often created through emotional stability. Human beings are naturally drawn toward people who possess direction, purpose, and internal certainty. Why? Because certainty is rare. Most people are emotionally reactive. Most people collapse under rejection. Most people lose themselves trying to hold on to someone else. But when you remain grounded through pain, you become different. There's also a deeper philosophical truth here. Every relationship eventually reveals whether you are building your identity around connection or around character. If your identity collapses the moment someone leaves, then your foundation was never fully yours to begin with. This is why heartbreak can become transformational. It exposes the parts of yourself you abandoned while trying to be loved. And once you reclaim those parts, your entire life changes. Whether the avoidant returns or not becomes secondary, because now you're no longer living from emotional scarcity. You're building a mind, a body, a purpose, and a life that no longer depends on one person's validation to feel complete. And paradoxically, that is often the exact moment they begin seeing your worth more clearly than ever before. The people who become impossible to replace are usually the ones who stopped trying to compete for love and started competing with the person they used to be. One of the most destructive patterns in relationships with avoidance is the habit of rewarding emotional distance. Most people don't even realize they're doing it. The avoidant pulls away, becomes inconsistent, stops communicating clearly, gives mixed signals, and instead of creating consequences, the other person responds with more understanding, more patience, more emotional availability. They overextend themselves trying to save the connection. Now, compassion is important. Patience matters. But there's a difference between understanding someone's emotional wounds and allowing those wounds to repeatedly damage your self-respect. And this is where many people lose themselves. They confuse unconditional love with unconditional access. Psychologically, human beings repeat behaviors that produce rewards. If someone learns they can disappear emotionally, neglect the relationship, avoid accountability, and still receive loyalty, attention, reassurance, and emotional security from you, then nothing inside them is forced to change. The dynamic becomes emotionally comfortable for them, even if it's painful for you. This is why boundaries matter. Not because boundaries are punishment, but because boundaries restore reality. They teach people that connection requires mutual effort, mutual respect, and emotional responsibility. Without boundaries, relationships become one-sided emotional systems where one person sacrifices themselves to maintain closeness while the other controls distance without consequence. And over time, resentment grows. The tragedy is that many people are so afraid of losing the avoidant that they tolerate behaviors they would never normally accept. They silence their needs. They minimize their pain. They convince themselves that if they can just love harder, stay calmer, ask for less, eventually the avoidant will feel safe enough to commit fully. But relationships don't improve when one person slowly disappears to keep the other comfortable. They improve when both people are forced to confront reality. When you stop rewarding emotional inconsistency, something powerful happens psychologically. The avoidant can no longer rely on certainty. They can no longer assume you will always remain available regardless of how little effort they invest. And for many avoidants, that certainty was silently carrying the relationship the entire time. The moment access to you is no longer guaranteed, the emotional equation changes. Now they feel tension. Now they feel the possibility of real loss. Now they are confronted with the consequences of emotional withdrawal instead of being protected from them. This is important because avoidants often suppress emotions until consequences become undeniable. As long as they believe they still have control over the connection, they remain emotionally detached. But once they sense the relationship is genuinely slipping away, emotions they previously buried begin surfacing. Regret, anxiety, curiosity, longing. Not because you manipulated them, because reality finally interrupted the pattern. There's also a deeper philosophical principle here. Every time you tolerate behavior that violates your self-respect, you unconsciously teach yourself that your needs matter less than maintaining connection. That mindset destroys confidence over time. You begin abandoning your own emotional truth just to avoid conflict or abandonment. But real confidence comes from alignment. It comes from knowing that your standards do not disappear simply because you love someone. And ironically, people often respect you more when they realize your love is valuable enough to lose. You cannot build a healthy relationship by rewarding unhealthy behavior. Eventually, every person must decide whether their fear of losing someone is greater than their commitment to respecting themselves. Because the moment you stop accepting emotional crumbs is often the moment people realize your presence was never something they should have taken for granted. One of the most misunderstood dynamics in human psychology is the difference between attachment and detachment. Most people think attachment creates closeness, but in many cases, especially with avoidance, excessive attachment creates pressure. And pressure to an avoidant mind feels like a threat to freedom. This is why so many people unintentionally push the avoidant further away while trying desperately to pull them closer. When your emotional state depends entirely on another person's behavior, energy changes. You become hyper-focused on responses, validation, reassurance, consistency. Every delay feels personal. Every moment of distance feels dangerous. And without realizing it, you begin communicating fear instead of connection. Avoidants feel that pressure immediately. Not always consciously, but emotionally. Because avoidants are highly sensitive to feeling emotionally trapped, obligated, or responsible for another person's stability. The more they sense dependency, the stronger their instinct becomes to create space. This is why chasing rarely works long-term. Even if it temporarily pulls them back, the underlying emotional dynamic remains the same. But detachment changes the dynamic completely. Now, detachment does not mean becoming cold, cruel, or emotionally unavailable yourself. It means releasing the need to control outcomes. It means your peace no longer rises and falls based on another person's attention. It means you stop gripping so tightly to the relationship that you lose your sense of self inside it. And psychologically, that shift is powerful. Because when you become emotionally independent, you remove the tension the avoidant was resisting in the first place. Suddenly, conversations feel lighter. Your energy feels calmer. There's no desperation to force closeness, no constant demand for reassurance, no emotional panic underneath every interaction. And here's the paradox most people never understand. Detachment often creates attraction because it restores freedom. Human beings naturally move toward what feels emotionally safe and move away from what feels emotionally consuming. When someone senses that your happiness no longer depends entirely on them, they stop feeling trapped by your expectations. And that emotional space allows curiosity to return. This is where the avoidant mind begins shifting internally. Because while avoidants fear emotional engulfment, they are also deeply unsettled by true emotional loss. They want distance, but they don't necessarily want disconnection. They want freedom, but they also want to feel emotionally significant. And when you become genuinely detached, they suddenly lose certainty about their place in your life. That uncertainty creates reflection. Now they wonder if you're moving on emotionally. Now they question whether they misjudged your value. Now they begin feeling the emotional weight of your absence instead of simply managing your presence. Philosophically, detachment is really about reclaiming inner stability. It is the realization that love becomes unhealthy the moment it requires self-abandonment. Too many people sacrifice their emotional balance trying to maintain connection with someone emotionally unavailable. They become consumed by anxiety, overthinking, and fear of loss. But real emotional power comes from standing firmly within yourself, whether someone stays or leaves. That kind of stability changes every relationship in your life because it removes emotional desperation from your energy. And desperation is never attractive. Peace is attractive. Confidence is attractive. Emotional groundedness is attractive. The avoidant often expects you to remain emotionally attached no matter how distant they become. So when they encounter someone who can love deeply without losing themselves, it disrupts their expectations entirely. Because the strongest form of attraction is not obsession, it's emotional self-possession. The moment you stop needing someone to choose you is often the moment they begin fearing what life looks like without you. One of the greatest illusions in relationships is that people fully understand your value while you are constantly present in their life. Most of the time they don't. Human psychology adapts quickly to consistency. What is available every day eventually becomes emotionally normalized. Your support, your patience, your loyalty, your reassurance, all of it slowly becomes part of the emotional background of their life. And when that happens, people stop consciously recognizing the depth of what they are receiving. This is especially true with avoidants. Avoidants often struggle to process emotional connection in real time because emotional closeness activates discomfort inside them. Instead of fully leaning into connection, they create distance to regain emotional control. But here's the paradox. While they are distancing themselves, they are also unconsciously relying on your emotional presence far more than they realize. They rely on your consistency. They rely on your understanding. They rely on the emotional safety of knowing you are there. And because that support becomes psychologically familiar, they begin assuming it will always exist. That assumption is what prevents appreciation. This is why your absence becomes transformative. Not because absence is a manipulation tactic, but because distance creates contrast. And contrast creates awareness. When your energy, attention, and emotional support are no longer available, the avoidant is finally forced to experience life without the emotional stability you quietly provided. At first, many avoidants appear unaffected. In fact, they often seem relieved immediately after creating distance. Why? Because short-term separation temporarily removes emotional pressure. They feel freedom, control, space, but over time, something deeper begins happening psychologically. Reality begins replacing emotional avoidance. The routines they associated with you disappear. The emotional comfort they took for granted disappears. The quiet reassurance of your presence disappears. And suddenly, the emotional absence becomes impossible to ignore. Human beings often understand value more clearly through loss than through possession. This is why memory becomes powerful after separation. The mind naturally compares present emotional experiences with past emotional experiences. And when the avoidant begins interacting with other people, they often discover something unexpected. Not everyone offers the same level of patience, depth, loyalty, understanding, or emotional safety you provided. That comparison creates reflection. Now they start remembering the conversations they ignored. Now they start replaying the moments they dismissed. Now they begin recognizing qualities in you they failed to appreciate while they still had access to them. And this process is intensified because avoidants frequently suppress emotions instead of processing them immediately. While emotionally connected, they focus heavily on discomfort, pressure, fear, or vulnerability. But once distance removes those immediate emotional triggers, clarity slowly emerges. The emotional noise fades, and they begin seeing the relationship from a different perspective. This is why time affects avoidance differently than many people expect. The emotional impact often hits later. But here's what matters most. Your absence only becomes powerful when it is authentic. If you disappear while secretly revolving your entire life around whether they notice, your energy remains emotionally attached. True absence is not just physical distance. It is emotional release. It is genuinely redirecting your energy back into your own growth, your own purpose, your own peace. Because the deeper lesson here is not about making someone miss you. It's about understanding your own value enough to stop overgiving to people who only appreciate your presence once it's gone. There is a philosophical truth hidden inside all human relationships. Familiarity often blinds people to blessings they have not yet lost. And sometimes the only thing powerful enough to restore perspective is absence. When someone can no longer feel your warmth every day, they finally begin understanding how cold life feels without it. And that realization changes people. Not always immediately, not always permanently, but deeply. Because your absence has the power to teach lessons your constant presence never could. Sometimes people only recognize the importance of your energy after they are forced to live without it. At the deepest level of all human relationships, there is a question most people never consciously ask themselves. Are you trying to be chosen, or are you becoming someone who no longer needs to be chosen to feel complete? Because those are two completely different psychological states. When someone is emotionally attached in an unhealthy way, their identity becomes externally validated. They measure their worth through another person's attention, consistency, and approval. And when that approval is withdrawn, especially by an avoidant, it creates a kind of internal collapse. Suddenly, everything feels unstable. The mind starts negotiating, overthinking, revisiting the past, trying to fix what was never fully in your control. But transformation begins when you stop making another person the center of your emotional identity. Becoming the person they can't replace is not about competition with others. It is not about proving superiority or trying to outshine anyone. It is about something far more fundamental, becoming internally anchored. It is about building a life, a mindset, and a presence so grounded that your value is no longer negotiable in your own eyes. Psychologically, this shift happens when external validation stops being the source of emotional stability. Instead, stability comes from discipline, purpose, self-awareness, and consistency. You begin to understand that your life cannot be outsourced to someone else's emotional availability. And when that realization fully lands, your behavior changes without effort. You stop over-explaining. You stop chasing clarity from people who give confusion. You stop trying to earn basic respect. And that shift is what makes you unforgettable. Because most people operate from emotional reactivity. They panic when they feel distance. They rush when they sense withdrawal. They overgive when they feel insecurity. But when you evolve into someone who no longer reacts from fear, you become psychologically distinct. There is calm in your presence. There is direction in your energy. There is emotional structure where there used to be chaos. And avoidants notice that difference more than anyone else. Because avoidants are often used to dynamics where emotional intensity equals instability. They expect pursuit. They expect fluctuation. They expect emotional pressure. So when they encounter someone who is no longer reacting to them, no longer chasing them, no longer emotionally collapsing around them, it disrupts their internal expectations. But here's the deeper truth. You don't become valuable because someone else realizes it. You become valuable when you stop abandoning yourself. When you begin prioritizing your growth, your standards, your emotional health, and your long-term direction, something shifts in your identity. You are no longer operating from loss. You are operating from expansion. Your life is no longer organized around what you are missing, but around what you are building. And this is where real strength develops. Because becoming the person they can't replace is not about holding on to them emotionally. It is about reaching a level of self-respect where your presence is no longer tied to desperation. If they return, they are meeting a different version of you. If they don't, you are still building a life that feels meaningful without them. That is emotional independence at its highest level. And paradoxically, that is exactly what creates the strongest form of attraction. Not because you are trying to be seen, but because you are no longer lost in needing to be seen. Your value becomes obvious in your calmness, your direction, and your refusal to abandon yourself for connection. At that point, you are no longer asking to be chosen. You are already choosing yourself, and that changes everything. When you step back and look at everything you've heard, the real message was never about chasing someone, convincing someone, or trying to decode someone's behavior. It was always about one thing, your state of being. Because in relationships with avoidant dynamics, people become obsessed with control. Control the outcome, control the timing, control the emotions, control the response. But life doesn't reward control. It rewards alignment. And alignment means you stop betraying yourself in the name of attachment. The moment you stop chasing, you regain clarity. The moment you stop rewarding inconsistency, you regain standards. The moment you detach emotionally from outcomes, you regain power. And the moment you focus on building yourself instead of fixing someone else, you regain identity. That is the entire shift. And here's the truth most people only understand after experience. If someone is meant to come back into your life, it will never be because you collapsed emotionally trying to hold on to them. It will be because you became someone grounded enough that your presence felt different, stable, and real. But even that is not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is not to be chosen by someone who left you confused, drained, or uncertain about your worth. The real goal is to become so internally solid that anyone entering your life has to match your standards, not define them. Avoidants may return. They may not, but that was never the true measure of your progress. The real measure is this. Did you stop abandoning yourself for someone who couldn't meet you fully? Because once you stop doing that, everything changes. Your energy changes. Your decisions change. Your relationships change. And most importantly, your life stops revolving around emotional uncertainty and starts moving toward personal certainty. And from that place, you don't chase love anymore. You embody it. You don't beg to be understood. You become clear enough that the right people don't misunderstand you in the first place. And you don't wait for someone to come back and complete your story, because you finally realize the story was always yours to complete.